Hey everyone, welcome back to our second webinar in Teams Essentials, Creating Teams and Channels for Long-Term Success. My name is JoAnna Battin, and I'm the Director of Strategy and Advisory Services at Xgility. And I've been about 20 plus years in working with Microsoft products from SharePoint, before it was actually called SharePoint, to Office 365. I actually became a consultant because of SharePoint. So I like to joke that SharePoint is my first love. But the last 3 years have really proven that the tools that Microsoft has presented to us are so valuable and feature rich, but that people needed to have some kind of context around how everything fit into the ecosystem. And so I've spent the last 3 years focused on strategy, helping people not just turn on the tools and make them available, but also how to get adoption and how to really roll them out in the organization and plan for that. So today we're going to talk about why teams and channels, right? Teams and the channel structure and how you configure and how you set up a team is really critical. But just know all of the key components. Take the chat functionality. Most people use the chat functionality first. And when you use that, it's great, right? Because you're able to communicate and talk to others and connect with your coworkers. But the next piece of that is, how do I actually use Teams? How do I set it up and what do I do with it in order to be more productive? And so we have to start talking about what channels structure and team structure looks like and what things to consider. And understanding those key decision points, when to create a team versus when to create just a channel, are super important too. And most of the time, sprawl and chaos happens because you're really just trying to roll things out. You're really just trying to make things available, and somebody else is creating something. You're creating the same team for the same purpose at the same time as somebody else. And so you end up with a couple, and then things are left or abandoned. And I know for a fact our customers are talking to us about this and asking for advice, and our potential customers, and I'm sure that's probably why you're here. What do I do to keep sprawl from happening? And it's that thinking before you actually do anything. So we're going to talk through all of that. What are the considerations and what do you have to think about? And then we're going to talk about what is it, obviously, what is a team and a channel? Do I create a team versus when do I create a channel? How do I add users? How do I manage them? What are the naming conventions? Some of those things. And then I'm going to hold off on private channels until the end, because I think you need to have a really good understanding of how Teams works before you start creating private channels. Private channels are absolutely, or were absolutely, the most requested functionality in Teams. But there are some gotchas, and we want to make sure that you understand what those are and the infrastructure that's behind it and how that can affect you. So before we get started, I just really wanted to talk about last week. Microsoft released their Q3 earnings report. And I think one of the funniest parts was that they actually did it within Teams. So I love that Microsoft is really embracing the fact that they can have large groups of people within Teams. That should really tell all of us something. Confidence in the infrastructure that's behind Teams and what they have going on. So that was pretty cool. The other thing is that 75 million daily active users. That's really unbelievable. And I know that it's because of the situation that we're in with many offices being closed and people working remotely. But that number, and really just the volume of people who went in just a matter of weeks, right? Because 6 weeks before that, we were at 44 million. Now we're at 75. Just number of users who are taking on Teams has just increased exponentially. But when you start adding that many people into a system without some kind of strategy and without some kind of thought process before just creating this environment, sometimes you do end up with a little bit of chaos. And so you may not be able to resolve what has happened up until this point, but hopefully anything that you do moving forward, you'll have a bit of context around it, and we'll be able to help you to move from there. And then evaluate what you have when things calm down and after you're done working through this process. But it should at least give you an idea that this is not going away. Teams is going to be available. Teams is going to be the next wave of what we do. And once you get used to it in an environment like we're in now, it's going to be so much easier to really share with your team and work with your team as we get back to some sort of normalcy in the workplace and actually have offices opening back up again. So before we get started, I really want to talk about, this is such a big topic. I could spend the next 3 hours talking about that. Obviously, we don't have the time. So I'm going to hurry up and try to get through as much as I can here, but we can't possibly cover everything. So look for future webinars, look for videos that we'll have available to you soon, and really happy to share as much information with you as we can to help you in this time and to help you to avoid some of those roadblocks that you might be bumping up against. All right, so first things first, what happens when you create a team? One of the biggest questions, or one of the biggest, from IT perspective, one of the biggest things that people always say is, it's just a security group. Add the Office 365 group, and that will grant me permissions. In fact, it's a little bit more than that. And so we need to talk about what that looks like. When I create a team, I am in fact creating an Office 365 group. But the Office 365 group is not just a security group. It's not just a group of people that you assign permissions to something. When you create a team, there is a grouping of functionality and features and infrastructure. I call it infrastructure because it really is like its own piece of infrastructure. It's a SharePoint site collection. It's a document library. It's all of the pieces that you need to actually make teams work. That includes, there's a lot on the back end, and there are some pieces there, but understanding that it's not just security, although we are wrapping that with a security wrapper so that you can, as a user, assign permissions for who gets access to your environment, your team, or not. So there is a security piece of this. But from an IT perspective, or from a tenant level perspective, all that they see and all that the IT users see is the people. So that should somebody not be able to get in, should you need to add somebody else, they can add them without actually seeing your content. They say it on purpose that way because the infrastructure and that bubble, that's, people probably laugh, but that's what I use. You really have this security bubble. And so when you create a team, you've created this environment that is your own. It's a standalone site collection that you control your users, your members, who else can be an owner of that environment. And so as we start talking about things that can be done, potentially there are ways to get around some of the features, some of the issues, or some of the gotchas that you might have, but do you really want to do it? And if I put that in context there, you'll understand why I'm speaking to that here in just a minute. So we have this bubble, we have this security environment, there is infrastructure that's created. So of course, we want to make sure that we're thinking about things ahead of time before we actually do it. So when I say the number one question that people ask me is, when should I create a team versus when should I create a channel? And the answer to that is that there isn't really a right or wrong answer. And I know that that sometimes seems like a cop-out for me to say, but it's true. Every circumstance is different. And the way that your data is different. And the use and the functionality that you want to use that team for can make the difference between whether or not you create a team versus whether or not you create a channel. So my advice really is put some thought into it. I recommend to people, think about what you're doing and the data that you're going to be storing and the information and the people who are going to be using it before you start just building out. Your naming conventions and all of that will be determined based on the information and what your purpose is for that team. And then, always try to do what you can to keep it out of the box. You'll understand what I mean when we start talking about things like it's SharePoint in the back end, right? We talked about SharePoint as being the back end of Teams. And there are ways to break inheritance and assign different people permissions and grant somebody access to the document library that's on the back end. And from an IT perspective, we want to be able to solve those problems. From a user perspective, the messaging of that is so important. If I tell you that you have total control over who has access into your environment, yet on the back end, I'm breaking that inheritance and I'm doing things that are not really keeping that bubble secure, then my message to the users is different. And so I try to encourage people, use the tools, know the limitations, and then make your decisions based on that information. The biggest thing to consider, it's 1 terabyte of data. So we're creating a brand new site collection. Out of the box, by default, 1 terabyte of data is available to users. Now I'm going to pause there for a second because I can change the 1 terabyte per team. I can change that infrastructure. But do you really want to? That question is really important because why would you have more than 1 terabyte of data? There probably could be some examples of when that would be appropriate, But when you're thinking about it, instead of thinking about changing the default behavior, reconsider the information that's going to be stored there. How am I going to archive information? How am I going to save things out? How am I going to structure it? We'll talk about that here in a minute when I show you teams. And then remember that if you have permissions to a team, you have permissions to everything inside of that team. Private channels are the exception, and that's why I'm going to save that for last. But I want to go on the premise of, if you have access to a team, you have access to everything that's there. There's not a read only. You're able to do whatever it is that the owner of that team allows you to do. And in many cases, that is to see everything and be able to control many things. So if everybody's ready, I think we'll go ahead and switch over to teams, and I'll walk you through how to set up a team, and we'll go through the considerations at every step and things that you need to take into account. So here we are in teams, and based on the feedback from the poll, there are some people who can create teams on their own or who are granted the ability to create the teams on their own. And then there's a group of you that your IT in the organization has some control over that environment. And I understand from both perspectives. From an IT perspective, I want to have control and I want to limit that sprawl, especially in this environment. From a user's perspective, I just really want an environment that I can create and have collaboration. And so it's important as we think through this, what is it that you're going to allow users to do from an IT perspective? What is it that you're going to allow users to do? And if you limit too much, then you're going to end up with third-party applications. And so just think about that as you're trying to roll it out. There are some things that you can do for governance. And again, I think we'll talk about that in a later session. But there are things that you can do in governance that will help to eliminate some of the fear that might be there associated with sprawl. But also talking to people and understanding what those limitations are and what you need to think about before you do it goes a long way in limiting that sprawl. So let's go through how to create a team. If I'm a user and I have the ability to create a team, I'm going to see this. Actually, if I don't have the ability, I'm going to see it. If I click on this and I get an error message that says you're not able to create an Office 365 group. Remember at the beginning I said, when you create a team, you're creating the group, which is the infrastructure. That's the error that you're seeing. That's the message that you're getting. You're not able to create that infrastructure that's required to create a team. But let's just assume you are able to go ahead and create it. We're going to click join or create a team. And we are presented with these. Now, I want you to remember these examples here. Retail, it says public, Mark 8 is public. These are examples of public teams. So when I go to create a team, I'm presented with, I can build the team from scratch, right? That means I start from the very beginning, I build my channel structure, I build the name, I do everything that I need to do. Or I can create from an existing Office 365 group or team. Now this is, I would say, fairly new from an existing team, but the important thing to remember here is people who had Office 365 before the implementation of Teams, Office 365 groups, you were able to create those within Outlook and you were able to manage them there. That's the infrastructure we talked about. That's been around for a while. The Teams functionality that sort of sits on top of it and layers on top of that, this is allowing you then the ability to take an older Office 365 group that you had in your environment and add Teams functionality to it. The other thing that this option does for you is allow you to choose whether or not you want to use another team as an example or as a template in order to create your brand new team. So if I've got a channel structure set up, I have things that I want to bring over, maybe the same members, and I continually create those, I can use another team to help to facilitate that. It's a really cool feature, and I can click and choose what options are available or what items I'd like to bring over. Just remember when you use another team as a template that you have to be careful because any tabs that are configured or custom configured, they're not going to come over at all. And so you would need to do a code-based template in order to make that happen. But this gives you the real good functionality that you want, members and tabs and the channel structure that you're looking for. And we're gonna go ahead and build a team from scratch because I wanna walk you through some of those options. So remember earlier I was talking about these teams back here that said that they were public. So what you're presented with is public and private. And when we talk about public, we're not talking about public necessarily to outside the organization. We're talking about public to your organization. So Can people see them and then join them? Or do you want to keep it private and you get to invite them into your environment? That's really the difference between here. So if you were to select public, users would come in here when they were going to create a team and they would see it available, and then they could join it. We're going to go ahead and create a private team. And the very first thing is my team name. And I always tell people to be very careful at this spot, because the team name is really important. Because remember, that infrastructure is all created based on this name. So if I call it something with a bunch of characters or spaces, I had one where somebody did that old emoji, like the little guy doing this. Microsoft will handle that on the back end. Microsoft will strip out the special characters that aren't allowed and create a team for you. But it's not necessarily the right way to do it. I've seen some pretty interesting names for teams. What I recommend is think about the team name and the purpose of the team name. We're going to circle back about having that thought process first, right? Before I even do this, I should know what the purpose of my team is, what the intent is, who the people are that I'm going to invite, all the considerations. Maybe I don't necessarily know what my entire channel structure would be, but I should have a really good idea of where I want to start, because you shouldn't actually be creating a team without that information. So when I create a team and I give it a name, the other thing that's important for you to pay attention to is if I'm in a department, I have 10 other departments in my organization, and I call this budget because it's my budget team. Well, how many other people in the organization are going to create a team called budget? Probably more than one. And Microsoft will handle it on the back end. They'll add the very first person who types the team name budget and creates it, the Office 365 group, will be called budget. And the subsequent ones will have budget 1, budget 2, budget 3, however many that is. So give it enough specific information that you can recognize what it is and give clarity to the people who are looking for it, but not so long and detailed that you're creating this very long Office 365 group name. Because remember, that's actually tied to an email address that is part of your team's infrastructure. And then I always like to suggest that people add a description, because on the backside, on the tenant administration side, if IT is looking at that and they're looking to see who owns this team, they can always tell by the description, or they should be able to tell by the description. The other thing that I've done it the entire time that I use it is you don't have to use the word team in your team. We know that it's a team, so call it something besides using the word team in there. Saves you a little bit of space, makes it a little more clear. So I'm going to give my team a name, and I'm going to click create. And within a couple of seconds, I have my environment ready. The next thing that I'm offered is the ability to add users from here. Now, as the person who's creating this team, I automatically am put into the owners group. So I am an owner of my team just by virtue of creating the team itself. So at this point, if I want to add other people, I'm going to add Megan. I'm going to click add, and the screen will flip here for a second, and you'll see that automatically she's added as a member. If I wanted to right now, I could change her and make her an owner. And she'll get a message on the backside. She'll get a message that she was added to my demo environment team as a member first, and then get another update that says that she has been made a member. But I can also, if I wanted to, I could add multiple people here. And add them at the same time. So continue to add your people from this screen. I can select and say Brian and Bo, I want to make sure that they're both members. I like to recommend at least 2 owners. If somebody goes on an extended leave, somebody goes on vacation, you need to be able to get access to that environment, and that's what that is. Click close, and there's my environment. Notice I have posts. We talked about that in the previous webinar. If you haven't seen that one, go check it out, because we go into detail about what meetings are. We talk about the options for posts and some of the tools and tricks and tips for that, as well as meetings. And then we have the file structure here, which again, remember I said files on the back end, it's SharePoint. This is actually creating the environment here. And so on the back end, this is a SharePoint environment, but the user interface is so much more friendly. And so we want to expose the SharePoint environment in a way that users don't necessarily feel like it's the SharePoint that it's SharePoint where they have to understand technically how to use it. It's a real easy interface. We're going to get into collaboration and file structure in the next webinar. So come back and join us for that one, and we'll really talk about some really great features for collaboration and co-authoring and some of those things. So I have my environment. You notice it's the demo environment. If I were to go and dig into this a little bit more, I could get to the administrative permissions. And so we're going to talk about that in a later date too, because there's so much to cover on what you're able to do and not do, or what you're able to do and manage that your users don't do from the administrative perspective. So come back and join us for that one, and we'll dig into that. But you notice what happened. By default, my general channel was created. And general is the default channel. Don't try to delete it. Don't try to get rid of it. Don't try to rename it. It's really important that you understand that is the basis of the collaboration space here within Teams. The next thing that you want to do is think about, or have already thought about, what your channel structure is going to be. And I'm going to circle back up here again to the strategy and advisory services. And there are a lot of ways to slice and dice the data. And the first that I'll talk about is when many people are moving things from file shares into Teams. And as you're moving things from the file shares into Teams, sometimes when you go through and you look at the file structure, you have very heavy hierarchy in your file structure. And so I like to talk to people about that. In the new model, we're talking about flattening that structure, removing some of that hierarchical structure and make it more flat. Does that mean that at every step or every time you go into a subfolder inside of your file shares that you should create a new team? Not necessarily, but let me give you this piece of advice. If I click on a file share and I open up a file share and the next thing I see is nothing but another folder, that should tell me that my team should not start at the top level. My team should not start at that very first. And if I click into that folder structure and there's nothing else but folders within that, that's not the place for me to start either. So pay attention to how many times you're clicking down your hierarchy in order to get to the real data. And pay attention to what the data is that you're trying to get access to. And also who needs to have permissions. Because I could have a very intense hierarchy in my file shares and the data that I want to move in. But at some point I have folders and I have files that are inside folders, and I may have specific permissions on each of those folders. That's actually a really good indication that those should at least be new teams. Why? Because one of the very first things that we said is, remember, everybody gets access to everything within a team. If they get access to the team, they get access to everything that's inside of there. So very specific permissions, that's always a key. I'm also going to give you an example of when you might consider creating a new team versus a channel for archive purposes. So if I were to go through and create a budget team, and I had maybe in 2018, 2019, 2020 budget, maybe I'm working on 2021 budget, and I wanted to create one team that was budget and then 4 different channels for each of those budget years. If I need to have different people to have access to those different channels, what does that tell us? Everybody inside of a team has access to everything there. So by default, I have to be careful there. That's an indicator that I should be creating a team for each of those individual areas. The other thing is, what am I going to do long term? Am I going to want to archive 2018's budget when 2022 comes out? Probably. So if I'm going to want to archive specific data and not archive the rest of the team, I probably want to think about creating that channel as a team instead of creating that channel as a channel. So those are just a couple of real easy things for you to sort of take into account as you're thinking about building out those teams. At this point is when most people say, yes, but I could end up with 50 teams. Yeah, you could. And there's nothing wrong with that, because remember, it's that security bubble, it's the 1 terabyte of data, it's who has access to it, What information is it specific to, and what's the purpose of the team? So yeah, it's completely possible that you could end up with a large number of teams, but I don't want you to be afraid of that. There's one of two things happening. One is people are using teams, and that's a really good thing because you're centralizing all of your information. The second thing is maybe people are being added to teams that they don't need to be a part of, just for exposure, just for somebody to potentially ever get in there. I'm going to show you how to hide things just in case you're in a situation where you have teams that maybe you want to go every once in a while into, but you don't need to have them front and center for you. And so Microsoft introduced this concept of hidden teams. So if I go and I hover over this demo environment and I hover over, I'll see my ellipsis. And at the very top, it's hide. And you notice here, all of a sudden I have hidden teams available to me. I can collapse this so that I don't ever see those teams again. And what's left? The things that I'm working on a regular basis. Maybe I'm not working on this one either and I want to hide it. So all that I'm left with is one team, couple of teams that I work with on a regular basis. Just because it's hidden does not mean that I can't get access to it. I can always open it up, and I always get notifications that there's something in there if I'm mentioned or one of those things that I can use. If I wanted to move them back, it's exactly the same thing. I click on the ellipsis and I click show, and then it's back into my team's environment, or at least the top part of my team. The other option that I have is if I wanted to just show a particular channel, maybe there's a lot of channels that are available inside of a team, and I don't necessarily need to look at any of these other channels. I just have one. I can come over here to more options next to the channel and pin. And when I pin that, you'll notice here, I now have a new option, pinned, so that I don't have to go digging through my channels or digging through my team structure in order for me to be able to get access to the channel that I really need to get access to. And so same thing goes that I can pin it or unpin it and be able to manage that so that it's easy for me to use. The other thing that I didn't mention is that Microsoft introduced about a year ago the feature that if you don't touch a team within 45 days, if you go and do not actually work within a team's environment, the team's environment for 45 days, it will move it to hidden so that it will start to clean those things up for you. So again, I say that because I don't want you to be afraid of the fact that you might have 50 teams. That's okay. You want to have that collaboration space. You want to have that available for you to reach out to your colleagues or to work with your colleagues when the time is right. Don't be afraid of it. Move your teams around, move some things so that you're focused on the items that you need to have access to on a regular basis. So before we wrap up today, I want to talk about private channels. I saved it for the last because I wanted to make sure that you understood really how the basics out of the box, how Microsoft presented Teams to us to begin with. That whole, if you're a member of the team, you see everything concept, that you have this security bubble, that you're able to get access to things and be able to see everything inside of there. Private channels, when it was introduced, is very helpful in a lot of ways, but there are ways that you can get into trouble, either as a user or as an owner and administrator of a Teams environment. So let's talk about what those are. The very first thing is, when you create a private channel, it is not just creating the channel structure and the folder structure on the back end. It's actually creating a brand new site collection. So on top of my Teams infrastructure that I said is created as part of a team, it's actually creating a second environment. You want to talk about sprawl, you want to talk about some of the growth there. From an IT perspective, private channels does nothing but exponentially change the sprawl and the infrastructure that's available. So you want to think about that. The other thing is, as an owner, if I have by default my members on my team, and I use the default settings, I can have members on my team who create a private channel that I don't even see as the owner of the team, right? So default the settings for private channels on your team, unless you go and unselect them when you create the team. By default, users, members are able to create a private channel and exclude you as the owner from being able to get access to that. So we'll put out a little short video here in a little bit about how to turn that feature off, because I think that's really important. So on top of that environment where you're creating the private structure, or you're creating the private site collection, and then locking it down so that members can't create teams that you don't get access to. The other thing that's important for people to understand about private channels is that you can't add other people into a private channel. I can't create a team that has an environment where everybody is there and then I say, oh, but you know what, I want to create a channel and add one other person. That's not the functionality of a private channel. Private channels are to have a subset of the people who are a member of that team get access to that information. So if I have 10 people on a team and I want to create a private channel where only the managers within there have access to it, that's great. I'm going to select the people who are able to actually view into that private channel, not anybody else who doesn't exist as part of that. But again, the risk there is without turning off the default settings, or that your members are able to create environments or create private channels where they can have conversation that is not available to you as an owner. And because it's a specific site collection, there's no way to turn that functionality off. It's created, it's there. If you need to get information out of there because somebody did that accidentally, you're going to have to migrate it into another channel or another area. So just wanted to talk about key takeaways. Remember, teams and channel structure, there is no right or wrong answer. It is all circumstantial. Think about things before you just build it out. What information are you trying to gather? What information are you trying to store? And what kind of collaboration are you trying to perform? And who's going to be part of that? Who's going to be on my team? And what do I need to make sure I set up before I just invite people there? And your channel structure, remember, as you're building out your channel structure, you just want to make sure that you have an idea of where the collaboration breaks are, where it makes sense for me. I don't need to see everything. Maybe I just need to see a channel or two. That would make sense to create a specific channel. So just think about that. Think about the structure of your content. How your content is structured may not be how your teams are configured when you finally get that information over. But in this environment, the ability for you to give a central location to users to collaborate and communicate and keep things private within your own group is heads and tails above anything else that we've ever seen before. So hopefully you're as excited as I am to get your hands-on teams or to continue working with teams with some of the tips that we've given you.
Thanks, JoAnna. That was great. I always learn lots of good tips from you.
Thanks, Diane. I actually have one last thing. I realize that I'm not sharing my screen anymore. You have it up, but I wanted to say one last thing about when you create a new channel. When you add a new channel, there's a checkbox at the bottom that says automatically save this channel to everyone's channel list. By default, it's unselected. So pay attention to that checkbox, because what that means is that users won't actually see, or members of your team won't actually see the channel, and they'll have to dig into the hidden channels for it. Also, new members that you add to the team, it will be found in hidden channels as well. So just pay attention to that one. Just another quick tip before we go to other questions, just to help avoid confusion.
Okay, sounds good. So we're going to go ahead and begin answering questions received during the presentation. Quick reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. So JoAnna, our first question is, can I put standardization around naming of teams besides the guidelines you provided?
Sure. So there are ways through PowerShell to prepend or append specific department names or other characters. I've had some people who want to have a shortened department name or a code. There are some other unique requirements that some customers have wanted. And that is absolutely possible. So what it does is on the back end, when the team is created, it prepends or appends that code to the team name. More and more, we find though that as people are doing that, they're actually turning that functionality off, because it becomes more confusing to the users, the environment, and the email address and other things don't match what the name of the team is, because that actually happens after the team is created or after the Office 365 group is created. So there are ways to do it. My advice, though, really always is to think about the names of your teams before just creating them. And many times that solves the issues of naming conventions.
Okay. Another question. Can you discuss if SharePoint, the SharePoint document library and Teams file structure are synced?
Oh, okay. So they're not different. There's not a sync that needs to happen. When I say that SharePoint is the infrastructure behind Teams, that means that all you're seeing different, if you were to open it up in SharePoint and you were to open it up in Teams, it's pointing to the same place. If you're used to SharePoint, you'll see the SharePoint environment and that will be familiar to you. But if you're not used to SharePoint, the Teams environment just gives you a nicer user interface to get access to your files and view your files. So there's no need for a sync. There's no need for any sync to happen between SharePoint and Teams. It's really the same location.
Okay. Another question, and I do believe this is a pretty common question. Does it make sense to have an organization-wide team? And if so, is that a good or bad place for organization-wide file storage that people often need access to?
There is a lot of information there, and I'm going to try my best quickly to answer that question. So if we look at it from what Microsoft has provided to us for the tool set and where each of the tools that we have falls into place. Microsoft really looks at Teams as collaboration. We know SharePoint's on the back end, but look over the last couple of years what they've done with the SharePoint creation, right? You're presented with a team site template and you're presented with a communication site template. That's for dissemination or consumption. So if you're talking about collaboration, we want to work within Teams. If we're talking about consumption, you want to work within SharePoint. Back to the company-wide or organization-wide team, Microsoft just rolled out the new feature that any organization under 500 users gets an organization-wide team. I'd be careful and I'd be careful about using that, because if we look at Teams, it's collaboration. And so is the reason that you're looking to use that for collaboration, or are you looking to use that for announcements? If you're looking to use it for announcements or other things, there's another tool that we have available, and that's Yammer. And Yammer really has the purpose and the place inside of the ecosystem for those announcements or for the additional information that you want to make available corporate-wide. So if you're not introducing Yammer to the organization and there's no long-term plan to even think about that, then the organization-wide team makes a lot of sense. Hopefully that answered that question.
Yeah, that's good. So I know there's always lots of questions around how SharePoint and Teams works together, right? So another question back to that is if the question is, if our existing SharePoint sites have specified groups and permissions, does Teams override those permissions?
I think so I'm going to assume, based on that question, that is the classic environment that you're talking about. And in that case, it's the infrastructure is different. So I talk about it in terms of infrastructure on purpose. If you have the old classic infrastructure where it's one site collection and subsites and subsites and subsites, then it's not really the same. We have to look at that differently, and you have to evaluate what's currently there and how it's going to look in the modern sites. If you have somebody who's gone in after you created a team and the SharePoint site that is part of that team, and you've broken inheritance and assigned special permissions there, that's another story. I'd like to encourage people not to do it that way, because again, I think I talked about it in the beginning, you're overriding what Teams and the idea behind Teams, which is to keep it private and keep it secure. The real answer to your question is, if it's in that environment on the back end of Teams, you have allowed now people to come into your environment, so that will override it. I actually think I'd like to dig a little deeper into that question. I know that we don't have time, but I would assume based on that, though, you might actually be talking about classic sites.
Okay. Another question, and this is something I tend to do all the time. So they want to know, would my staff would like to be able to rename a channel? What can we do?
So channels are interesting because, and maybe we'll cover this as part of the administrative that we're going to do one on being a team owner and how to manage some of those pieces. But if I delete a channel, my folder on the back end in SharePoint isn't deleted. So if I try to rename something, the folder is not renamed. And so there's a lot that when you create a channel, it's important to think about the names of those channels first before you just go ahead and create them, because there are some limitations there. So I think the advice is think about the channel names before you just create them. But if you've got a scenario where you're trying to rename a channel, I would guess, and you're getting a failure, I would guess it's because a folder already exists with the name that you're trying to change it to, and you deleted one, and now you're trying to add another folder over top of it. Open the file structure in SharePoint, take a look and see what's there, and then deal with what you have in SharePoint first, and you might resolve your problem.
Okay, and then finally, so you talked about private channels, but besides limiting private channel creation, what are other things an owner can limit members from doing?
Sure. So we definitely want to cover all of that. Private channels and making sure that your members can't create private channels is number one for me. But you can do things like whether or not people are able to use emojis or GIFs, whether you want to keep it, very business-like or casual and fun. You can do things like allow members to create new channels or delete channels. Or allow them to edit their comments in the post. So there are a lot of things that you can do that will help you to put a little more control over your team. And remember, it's not just that setting is not across the board. That's per team. So you can have one team that you manage in one way and another team that you manage completely differently just because of who is part of that team.
Okay, so I have one last question, and then we'll wrap it up. And I think we're seeing a common theme around what we're all, as team owners and users, get confused about. So the last question is, can a channel be removed and the files archived?
So yes, a channel can be removed. The answer and the question about archiving is, are you trying to do that programmatically, or are you just trying to move them to a different location? Moving them to a different location, if you're just, you can automate that process through Power Automate if you wanted to. You could kick something off that would move it to, say, a location for consumption or a location for final, where it's going to finally live or be available to others. You can run on the admin. You're not able to do this as an owner. You're not able to do this except in the tenant level. But there is governance around being able to archive channels and archive teams themselves. And I know that we're going to cover that in a later webinar too. But remember, if I delete a channel, it doesn't ever delete the data that's on the back end. Assuming that there is data inside of the folder that is created when you create a channel, Microsoft is protecting you from doing something accidentally. So it's going to be there. How you control it and what you decide to do with that data when it's there is really critical.
Excellent. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up then. Thank you, JoAnna, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate your time.